Hey everybody, it's Irene with BrainStormAcres. And as you can see, I'm in my house. Now, this location is in the great room, also called the dining room, and it's frequently the site of much crafting. Today, I want to talk about, I feel like this video should be called something like Signs and Banners and Flags, oh my, you know? And it sort of chronicles my journey of making signs and banners and flags. 9 zillion years ago, when I was in like junior high school and stuff like that, the big thing at most of the churches in our area was banners that were changed with the seasons of the church. So for the Easter season, you'd have one set of banners, and for, that sort of thing. And, I remember people getting together and making all these kind of things, and I wasn't directly involved in most of it, but I was aware of it, and it was kind of fun and kind of interesting. And people still do that sort of stuff in the form of wall hangings and stuff like that for churches, for their houses, all that sort of stuff. And I've done the same thing for my own house. I've done a couple of wall hangings that were quilted, and I was aware that you needed to make sure you hang them out of the sun. But sometimes when you're doing it, you don't necessarily have the option of hanging something out of the sun, so you have to be aware of what the fabric is going to do. There are some fabrics that will hold up much better to sun exposure than others. So for instance, it's a very obnoxious fabric to work with, but ripstop nylon is an exterior fabric. I mean, they expect you to make coats out of it and flags that'll hang outside and things like that. So it usually is very resistant to fading and shredding and things like that. I just heard my phone. Let's see. I'm trying to get a package at the post office. Wasn't supposed to be sent to the post office, but they promised me they were sending something UPS. And then they sent it USPS. Well, that requires a different address. So anyway, I had to send Henry the information, and he was able to get it. One less thing lost in the mail, so to speak. Anyway, when I first started running my shop where I sell my jewelry, my initial thought was wood for signs. And this is actually the first decent sign that I ever made for my shop. It's a bit stained and dirty these days, but that's what it looked like. And the way I achieved this, because I could just see it, and somebody out there is going, oh, I could never do that because I can't draw that well. I didn't draw this, I traced it. At the time, one of the very popular things out there, and I assume they're still available, was you go to the store that sells office supplies, and they sell banner kits that you can use to make your own banners. So say I was a business and I was going to sort of a conference that wasn't super high-end, or I had a very small budget, I could print out a banner myself to have with my booth. And what they had with this was software. And the software, in those days, it came on a separate CD. I think it's part of the website or something now. But it allows you to choose the font. This is the font I chose. And then to print it. So this would have been printed out on multiple sheets of white paper so that I could try it out to see how it looked. Well, I did at one point actually use this to print on a plastic banner. You printed them onto stickers, like labels, giant labels, full 8.5 by 11 sheets of labels. And then you just slap them together on a plastic backdrop, and it worked fine. I mean, you have to line everything up carefully, but that's possible. But what that allowed me to do was it allowed me to do the same thing without the stickers. In other words, I could just print out the sections of the sign and then trace them onto a piece of wood and fill it in with paint. And that's all I did to create this. Nothing fancier than that. I am decent at coloring inside the lines, but other than that, that's what I did. And it allowed me to make a sign. Now, this sign was okay. I had a way of sticking it up on the front of the shop, and it stayed pretty well, but in really high winds, sometimes this end tended to pivot around. And one of the things I was concerned about was it rubbing on the canvas, because it's a canvas pavilion and you don't want to damage the canvas. It's a major investment. The other thing I had made at about the same time was a hanging sign that went outside, or actually it went on the front of the shop, and it hung down. And that's what I did, because at the time I was selling a lot of handmade glass beads and some jewelry, mostly made from the handmade glass beads. And this is just an old piece of plywood. I mean, these were both pieces of plywood. I knew enough to make sure that I chose plywood rather than solid wood for the larger pieces, because solid wood will tend to warp. And I knew there would be sun, and there would be moisture, and there would be a lack of moisture, and that would make regular wood warp. These are solid pieces of wood here. These were old boards that I literally had hanging around somewhere in the shop. And I made this to hang on the front of the shop. And it drove me crazy, because in the wind, and it's not doing it too badly right now, but it squeaks. And we sleep in the back of our shop. So when it was breezy at night, all you could hear was squeaky, 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 squeaky. It was very annoying. And I liked the way it looked. I liked the font. I liked the presentation, but I didn't like the squeak. And I didn't like the difficulty in packing it, because in order to pack this, and if you look at it closely now, this is old. This is probably 15 years old, maybe older. It's got some scuffs and stuff on it, and this kind of a sign is going to tend to do that. You have to wrap them up and pack them in cardboard, and it's big and it's clunky and it's heavy. And again, you're trying to hang it in such a fashion that it doesn't scuff the canvas. I had to come up with a new solution. I also wanted a little color. This was done on relatively short notice. It is double-sided so that it says the same stuff on the back of these. Does it say? Yeah, it's completely double-sided. I couldn't remember. For a first shot, it was great, but I wanted to do better, and I wanted some more color. So I decided that canvas, heavy canvas, like you could get the heaviest canvas that you could buy at the store, like Joann's sort of a store. And I got 2 colors of canvas because I wanted a touch of red on my sign. I figured, well, instead of just having the black and white, I'll have red around the edges, and then I'll do my usual treasury in a circle. Because I was painting it, I could use gold paint. I used the same sort of a font, and I could hang this on the front of the shop, and I didn't have to worry about it scrubbing on the canvas of the pavilion and doing damage. There's some fiddly bits in the back here. I experimented with different ways of keeping it stiff and all that sort of stuff. And I never was really in love with the solution. I still use this sometimes. I'm hoping to not have to use it much more because I'm hoping to have the time to redo it. But I did learn some very important things making this. They were things that I sort of knew but didn't think about at the time. So when I bought this red fabric, it came on a regular bolt of fabric, just like any other fabric. And it was a nice bright red, and that lasted for maybe a year. And then it became a rather dull, you can see it right on the edge here, you can see. It became a rather dull, pinkish tan sort of a thing. So what I did then was I cheated. I was not going to take off this binding, which was sewn on by hand and was a very large pain, and you guessed where, to get to lay right. I simply painted it with acrylic paints, and that's what everything on here is, by the way. It's acrylic paints. I didn't use anything fancy. I know there are fabric paints available, but my conclusion was the acrylic paints have worked just as well for me as any fancy fabric paint I might have had. I actually had leftover fabric paints when I started some of these projects because my daughter was big into fabric paints when she was in junior high school and early high school. And everything was puff paints in those days where you ironed the thing after it was done and then it all puffed up, and yeah. We did lots of crafty things in our house. Anyway, one of the important things that I want to mention to people is if you use colored fabric, especially like a canvas, because this was a heavy cotton canvas, it's going to fade. And it depends on where you put it as to how quickly it's going to fade. If I only did inside art events where I was going to have a banner behind me, say I'm sitting at a table with my stuff spread on the table, and I'm going to have a nice big banner behind me that says the name of my company and, you know, some clue about what I do or something like that. And I'm always inside, I really might get several years worth of use out of that banner before it got faded. But if I'm going to be outside, chances are within a year, especially if you're doing a lot of events, and when I started, I really wasn't doing that many events. I was probably only doing 3 or 4 a year. But the events are not just like for a few hours. They last usually 3 or 4 days, sometimes longer. So you're outside that whole time, and you would be surprised at how fast the colors will fade. So what I do now is if I want a stripe around the outside, I no longer use colored fabric. I paint it, because that paint is going to last a lot longer. And if I need to touch it up, I drag out the same color paint, put down a piece of cardboard on the table, lay it out, paintbrush, and it's fixed. So that was something that I was kind of disappointed with at the time, but I kind of learned to live with it. It's a fact of life. Like I say, there are fabrics that will really hold up better than others. This was a cotton, and it was the heaviest cotton canvas I could find. It was probably Joann's. I don't know. To be honest, that's a really long time ago. I couldn't tell you for sure. But I've used this canvas for other things. Actually, never on the surface. I've used the white canvas as an interlining for support on a dress. And it worked really well. And it was never washed, and it was never, it was never intended to be washed. So it's still got the sizing in it that comes with it that makes it stiff. Worked great. All I needed it for was support, so that was fine. But on a sign that's going to be in the sun, it's going to fade. And fading is a problem that you will deal with any fabric, just that some are worse than others. I also have some flags here that I'm going to be remaking. And when I made this flag, this was a bright, bright red. And this one was a bright, bright purple. And as you can see, it's sort of a lavender now. It's also a little shredded. These are, oh geez, I want to say maybe 8 years old. I don't know if they're that old. I think they're about 8 years old, yeah. Now you'll notice it gets shreddy, and that's just a fact of life. I did not do anything fancy with the edgings on these. I did bother when I was doing this kind of stuff here to do a lot of the work by hand so that it would look really finished. But when these flags are flown at the top, I'll show you how, I don't know if you can see the whole pole here, but if I start here and I go all the way up like this, it's like that. And this is a sleeve, and there's another pole that's, I think, 8 feet long that goes in the bottom. So these are, 15 feet in the air or something like that. And nobody's going to be checking your seams. So what I highly recommend is I used my sewing machine with a zigzag stitch, and I simply used a rolled hem on the edge of this, because it did not make any sense at all to do it by hand. Now, I was able to chat with somebody who